Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Policy Studies. IPS, in case you do not know, is the oldest multi-issue progressive think tank in the country, and very intentionally multi-issue because our founders realized that you cannot confront one injustice without confronting them all, and without seeing how they are related to each other. And we have active programs in a number of areas, including economic inequality and peace and disarmament and mass incarceration and criminal justice, to mention just a few areas. And my name is Basaf Sen. I direct the Climate Justice Program here, which looks at the intersection of climate change and environmental destruction with other social and economic injustices such as poverty, economic inequality, racism, sexism, and patriarchy, and so on. And my work here focuses on both building up progressive state and local climate policies that address social and economic justice at the same time as bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, and critiquing the extremely destructive agenda that we are now seeing from the federal government in this area. And with that, let me quickly introduce both our speakers here and then have each of them say a few words about their respective organizations, Kalpa Vriksha and the Next System Project. So Ashish Kothari is founder member of an Indian environmental organization called Kalpa Vriksha. He has taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, coordinated India's national biodiversity strategy and action plan process, served on Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India's boards, and helped initiate the global Indigenous Peoples and Communities Conserved Territories and Areas Consortium, and chaired an international union for the conservation of nature network dealing with protected areas and communities. He has co-authored or co-edited over 30 books and helps coordinate the Vikalp Sangam and radical ecological democracy processes in search of alternative well-being pathways to globalized development. His latest books are Churning the Earth, Making of Global India with Asim Srivastava, and Alternative Futures, India Unshackled, which he has edited with KJ Joy, and you can see copies of that book out there and purchase them. And then we have Johanna Bosu, Research Associate for the Next System Project. Her research focuses on transitioning from the extractive fossil fuel economy and building towards resilient and equitable communities based on energy democracy. Johanna received her MSc in Sustainable Innovation from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and she first worked with the Democracy Collaborative as a master's student while conducting research on how public ownership of electric utilities can be used as a strategy for energy democracy. She has organized around climate both in the US and the Netherlands, and most recently worked on fossil fuel divestment campaigns for pension funds, universities, and cultural institutions, alongside groups such as Fossil Free Netherlands and Both Ends. She was previously an Earth Science Information Partners Fellow, working to bridge the gap between scientists and society. Before we proceed, one quick announcement, which is that this event is being live streamed. You will all be on YouTube. And with that, Ashish, why don't you say a few words about Kalpavriksha, and then you say a few words about the Next System project.
Okay, thanks Vasu, and thanks to IPS for hosting this, and Next Systems project also for co-hosting. So the organization I'm here representing, and my colleague Pallav also, both of us are co-founders of this when we were in school, high school. We started the organization, so that's back in seems like a few generations back. 1979, I think.
Don't reveal that.
Okay, sorry. So there was a kind of a students group, a youth group, attempting to talk about, to do advocacy on, to make a noise about environmental issues in New Delhi. That time, that's where we were studying. From that sort of somewhat naive activism of those days, looking at animal rights issues and trying to protect the forest, the urban forests of Delhi, we moved fairly rapidly into looking at issues of development, doing an assessment of the big proposed Narmada River Valley projects, which many of you would be familiar with, and sort of increasing our own horizons to look at much broader issues of development and social justice and so on in conjunction with the environment. So over the last 40 years almost, we have been working on all these different issues, and especially in the last few years, having got a bit tired of saying no to everything, no to mines, no to dams, no to the state, no to corporations, no to capitalism, no to patriarchy, etc., which we still need to. We kind of started looking at what is it that we're saying yes to. So what are our own visions of, and what are the answers that people themselves are coming up with across the world. And so in the last few years, a lot more focus on looking at alternatives, both grassroots down to policy, practical alternatives. There's also conceptual frameworks of different visions of society. So that's the work of the organization.
Great. And again, yeah, thank you all for hosting, and excited, Ashish, to have a conversation with you and Vasav, and learn from you both as well. So I'm with the Next System Project, and the Next System Project is kind of a piece and component of what's called the Democracy Collaborative that was started in part by Gar Alperovitz, who was here at one point as well. And so we work on economic democracy, workplace democracy, and building out kind of a pluralist commonwealth. We have a lot of community wealth building that happens from an engaged practice perspective, kind of in the field, working with communities. And then we have our Next System Project that is a lot about kind of building the theory of economic democracy and working on some of these systemic problems and coming up with systemic solutions. I am myself relatively new to the Next System Project. I came on about 8 months ago now, and it's been really fun to be in a space. You know, I come from kind of similar in some ways. I come from a background of, you know, stopping fossil fuels, and so it's really been wonderful to spend a lot of time in designing what a future should look like and what we are, you know, what are the practical steps that we can get to these radical visions of what a future should be.
Great, thank you. And quickly go through a few logistics here. Restrooms are right out here. You know, you go down here and take a right, and they're right there. And there are, you know, 2 of them, both gender neutral. And if you want to get a glass of water or something, you can, you know, go down to the kitchen, and there's a water cooler there, and we have glasses. So with that, I will quickly announce one more event, and then we get started. Week from today, well, actually 6 days from today, next Tuesday the 17th, at noon, right here in this room, there will be an event on climate justice and the US-Mexico border. Very, very timely issue, and it was timely when I started putting the event together, and then recent events in the world have made it even more timely. And it'll be a fascinating conversation between an investigative journalist who is based in Arizona and looks at the border from a climate and ecological justice perspective, among others, with a local activist who works with Sanctuary DC, who works to protect undocumented communities right here. So yes, Tuesday the 17th at 12 noon in this room, so please come if you can. And with that, hand it over to Ashish, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Vasav. So I'm going to spend the next 15-20 minutes going through a set of slides. Sometimes when I don't use PowerPoint, I make this joke, which is not mine, it's from somebody else, that those who use PowerPoint are the ones who don't have the power to make a point. So you can see I don't have that power, so I'm using slides as a prop. But it also helps, especially outside India, just to be able to give some sort of visual context to what I'm talking about. Oh, did I? Yeah. All right. So the first part, a very short part of this is going to be the bad news, which is what globalized development is doing in countries like India. And the next part is going to be much longer on what is the sorts of positive responses that people are giving to the kind of destructive impacts of globalized development. If you look at what development has meant in countries like India, essentially, I guess we could characterize it as a form of violence. Violence against the rest of nature, as you can see in that image over there, which is an Indian multinational corporation talking about how if pipelines have to be laid, then barriers like nature have to be moved out of the way. So it's like, we don't seem to recognize that we are alive because of nature, but so nature is a barrier to development. And you see that kind of thing happening across the country, across the world, of course, wherever there's mining or dams or pipelines or whatever other so-called development projects there are. This one here is an image from the Ministry of Rural Development in India. And it's interesting because, again, you can actually see, it's not intended there, but you can see that what actually does happen in a lot of parts of India where when development needs land or it needs forests or it needs water or other natural resources and people resist the taking over of these sorts of resources, then armed forces are moved in or the police is moved in or possibly there's eviction that takes place in a forcible manner. So it's violence against communities, against their cultures, and you can actually think of, so when you go to a doctor and the doctor says you have growth, there's panic, right? I mean, do you think of it as cancer? In that sense, economic growth is also a form of cancer for the earth. So that's the only thing I'm going to say about the bad news. There's a lot more. A colleague and I did a book a few years back which has 300 pages of bad news. So if you want more details on what's happening, then you're welcome to pick up this book. So the question that we then raised to ourselves is there, are we stuck with Margaret Thatcher's famous dictum that there is no alternative, the Tina dictum, or do we actually have viable, feasible alternatives to this form of development? I think in order to answer that question, maybe the first thing to look at is what is it that we're asking alternatives to? And this is very important because in a country like India, I guess everywhere in the world, sometimes when people talk about alternatives, they're talking about, okay, how can we make growth greener? Or how can we recycle all the waste that we're producing? Or how can we make sure that waste produced in the US is exported to a country that wants the waste and we dump it there, right? And that's clearly, as far as I'm concerned, that's not really an alternative. An alternative is something where you're actually looking at the structural roots of environmental destruction, inequality, exploitation, etc. So the way I characterize it is essentially to talk about the concentration of power in the hands of corporations and capitalism, in the hands of the government and statism, one can call it, in the hands of men with patriarchy, in the hands of different kinds of castes and races and ethnicities, or the abled versus the disabled, and in the hands of human beings vis-a-vis the rest of nature or non-human existence. So if one is talking about alternatives, it seems to me we need to be talking about changing these fundamental structures of the concentration of power. And so that's what I'm going to look at. In India, one of the most important parts of the alternative is resistance, just being able to actually say no to this form of violent destruction. And you see that all over the place. This is from a demonstration from 30 years back against two big dams that were going to displace 300 villages and the forests in the Indravati River in central India. In a successful protest, those dams were never built. And there's similar protests happening across the country at any given time, probably in hundreds of places, very small to large sorts of resistance. Could even be individual forms of resistance where you say no to a particular form of consumerism, or you say no to a particular imposition of something that you're, that you feel is regressive. But along with resistance, it's very important to look at how do we also have constructive projects to meet the needs of people, because it does. It is a truth that there is a significant amount of deprivation from even basic needs across a country like India. Real poverty. I don't mean poverty in the way that the government often defines it, but real deprivation from water, from food, from livelihoods, from health, from education, and so on. And so one needs processes by which, and if the mainstream development model is not meeting that, what is it that could? So I'm going to very quickly give 2 or 3 examples of this, and we have publications where there are actually several hundred examples that I'll give you a website later on. This is one of the most inspiring ones for me. This is in central India, in the heartland of indigenous part of India and forested land, where this community, which was part of the anti-dam agitation, which picture I showed you earlier, 30 years back or so decided that they wanted to reformulate the whole decision-making process for themselves in such a way that they were not just reacting to threats from outside, but also what were the issues that they were feeling within the community itself. For instance, women were not part of the decision-making process. There were some people who were destroying the forest and selling it outside. So they formulated the village assembly, or reformulated it, and they decided that from now on, any decision that's to be taken for the village will be taken not by a government official, not by a politician, not by the village chief, but by the entire assembly by consensus. Even if it takes 5 days to reach a decision, they will do it only in that way. And they've practiced this for the last 30 years. And their main slogan is that we elect the government in New Delhi and Bombay, but in our village, we are the government. It's a form of direct democracy, and I'll come back to that in a minute, of what that means. An example from a city. This is a town in western India, in the district of Kutch, where several local slum colonies, that is squatter colonies, have mobilized themselves to be part of the city's governance process, to say that any decision that's to be taken for our neighborhood has to be taken only through us or with us. And they have through that actually created water self-reliance, housing, decent, local, low-cost, local building materials, housing, converted what used to be really bad housing conditions into much more decent and acceptable and dignified kind of housing, created energy security, and so on and so forth. A whole bunch of things that they've done. But the most important thing is to actually make the argument and live the empowerment of being part of the decision-making process. So have more direct democracy even at the level of the city. The third example I'd like to give you is from the south. This is about 2,500 to 3,000 Dalit women farmers. If you're all familiar with the caste system in India, the Dalits are the most oppressed, historically marginalized 250 million people who have been brutally oppressed for many centuries. And as women, it's a double dispossession. They're also small farmers, so it's a triple marginalization of many kinds. So in the last 3 decades, they've actually moved to bringing back their traditional diversity of seeds, bringing back their traditional knowledge of doing agriculture in an organic, sustainable way, creating land rights for women, which is very rare in a country like India, grain banks in each village, etc. And then also moving into, so through all of that, actually moving into food sovereignty, not just food security, but actually saying how are we to be in full control of everything to do with our food, land, seeds, water, knowledge, and so on. But also then moving into saying, okay, but the media is not actually supporting what we're doing, so can we create our own media? So running a community radio station, running a filmmaking unit, they made more than 100 films. They got trained in doing this themselves, all the way from the shooting to the editing and so on. And running their own school, because they're saying even the education system doesn't really go into it actually alienates our children away from our lives. So it's quite an incredible revolution, and through all of this, changing their status as marginalized Dalits, marginalized women, marginalized small farmers into something of much greater respect and dignity. The fourth example quickly I'd like to give you is that of education. I find it fascinating that the word school, the original meaning of the word school from the Greek eskole meant leisure. Okay, in India, as I guess most other parts of the world, schools are prisons. They're anything but leisure. And schools are essentially places where people are taught how to fit into the system. Just homogeneous boxes, like Pete Seeger's song of little boxes. You just fit into the system. These are alternative educational institutions at the school and college level, where children are actually, or youth are actually being facilitated to become responsible, questioning, dissenting adults, and not just accepting the system as it is. Learning, for instance, physics and chemistry by doing sugarcane juice making, okay? Or being part of community life and learning both the local traditional stuff and also what's coming from modern systems and trying to put the two together. Doing alternative architecture like this passive solar building in this school where when it's minus 40 degrees outside, they don't need any artificial heating inside, because with the passive solar they're actually warming up the building all the time. And so on. So that's the different kinds of learning mechanisms which are being attempted. And finally then, alternative media. Like I was saying about the Dalit women farmers, they felt that because their news was not being carried by the mainstream media, they needed to create their own system. So actually now, many more community radio stations, more movements to bring back old forms of communication like folk theatre, but also using new technologies like mobile phones, where you can actually be able to connect up. Bluetooth, for instance, in central India, there's something called Bultu radio, which is a local way of saying Bluetooth radio. It reaches out to a lot of people. So putting all this together, what we're talking about is what could be called something like eco-Swaraj. The word Swaraj comes from ancient Indian philosophy. It became popular during the independence movement. People like Gandhi brought it back into popular use. But it doesn't simply mean independence from colonization. It actually means my autonomy and freedom, or my community's autonomy and freedom, in responsibility to your community's autonomy and freedom also. So it's a very deep sense of responsible, regulated life, where even things like consumption get questioned, consumerism gets questioned, and you're actually talking about spiritual and material balance of the two. So that's basically what Swaraj is. So from that we evolved this thing of radical ecological democracy, which simply means these examples that I'm giving you and many more are really about people saying that we need to govern our lives. They cannot be governed by others. Democracy really means actually going to that kind of route. But we need to do that with sensitivity towards the ecosystem, towards the limits of the planet, and towards each other. So more social justice and equality and so on. So it's a very simple concept. But the crucial thing there is that the locus of decision making is at the level of the collective, the community, self-defined community, whether it's a village or it's an urban neighborhood or it's an educational institution or it's you folks in IPS. Basically, decisions that affect our lives need to be taken with and at the level of these communities, and then you build larger levels from that. This is of course happening not just in India but across the world. I love this map. It's an extremely decolonizing map, because otherwise we're so used to the colonial maps where Europe is on top and it's big, and you can see England, and here you don't even see England. That's the actual size of we used to do half the earth. So, but also just to be able to place on this map a whole bunch of very radical and creative alternatives that are happening across the world. I don't have time to go into all of these, but just to say that it's not just in India, but this is happening this kind of upsurge of creative new ways of looking at, or bringing back old ways and creating new ways of living is happening across the world. And there's a lot that we can learn from all of these. So just to end in the next couple of minutes, what we've been working on with movements in different parts of the world is to say, okay, what are the sort of key principles and processes that are emerging? So when you talk about that village in central India and it says, we are the government in our village, they're talking about radical direct democracy. And then from that building, the larger levels of delegated or representative democracy, where the power comes from the bottom, it's not from top down. Yeah, and also then beginning to talk about, do nation states make sense? If we want boundaries that are make ecological sense and cultural sense, then maybe a lot of our current nation state boundaries also need to be questioned. And we need to think of new ways of looking at politics and decision making. We then talk about where people are saying that the economy needs to be in our hands. The kind of thing that Johanna will be talking about, I'm sure, and you're working on, where you say that, well, if I'm a producer, I need to be in control of the means of production. Very simple thing. If I'm a consumer, I need to know what I'm consuming and not have to read the fine print and try and figure out what tetra, hecta, petra, whatever is, what does it mean? I mean, if you look at the boxes and what's in the ingredients, you'll never know what the hell that means. So, and doing much more localization. Instead of having American water go to Europe and European water coming to the US, or instead of my food having to come from 3,000 miles away, can we localize at least all the basic needs within a certain local region and not have economic globalization for depending on that kind of stuff. Of course, social justice, equality, equity, gender, caste, class, all those different struggles that we're all part of. But also looking at what is well-being. Going back to words, the word wealth has nothing to do with money. The original meaning of wealth was well-being. Now it means money. So how do you create sources of well-being which are really about being happy with social relationships, with family life, with learning processes, with being out in nature, and not having to buy a 50-inch color television set? Yeah. Cultural diversity and knowledge diversity. So for instance, the book that we've just done is a Creative Commons book. It's open for anybody to take, copy, reproduce in the way that you want. So can all knowledge be in the commons instead of being monopolized by, through private intellectual property rights and so on. And of course the fifth one is ecology. Without that we'd all be dead. So basically looking at these, and then at the core of all of that, a set of values which I think is emerging from, I'm not going to go into all of this, but a set of values that's actually emerging from these different initiatives. This is not something that I've come up with myself. It's basically what people are themselves articulating. So for instance, in those alternative education institutions, it's not competition, but cooperation that's emphasized. It's not about me coming first, it's about can we all collectively rise to the next level. Or what people are saying that instead of democracy being about politicians governing us, can we move far more towards self-governance and autonomy. So it's these sorts of values, or for instance, happiness being a more qualitative pursuit rather than more and more material possessions. The rights of nature, there's some amazing stuff happening now. For instance, just 3 days back, the Colombian High Court gave the Amazon rights, the Colombian Amazon rights, so rights of nature, rights of other species, and so on. I'm just putting this out there. There's a whole bunch of them which we can discuss. So I'm gonna, just one last thing is to say, in India, we have this process called the Vikalp Sangam, which is alternatives confluences, trying to get people who are working on these sorts of things together in different fields, because very often folks who are working on food manage to get together, but they don't necessarily get together with those who are working on gender justice, who don't get together with those who are working on health, who don't get together with those who are working on education. So getting them together to actually share experiences and practical solutions and so on, but also share visions and concepts of what a better future could look like. This is a website on which a lot of these alternatives are actually being documented. It already has 800 plus stories for India. So please do visit, especially if you're feeling depressed at any moment. Take a visit there and you will, I think, cheer up. There's a lot of good stuff happening. These are the confluences that we've had so far, the regional ones, they're thematic confluences, and we're actually beginning to talk about the possibility of more global confluences. There's been one in Lebanon recently, and saying, okay, can we actually start doing this in different parts of the world, and maybe at some point actually have a global alternatives confluences. Visioning processes of this kind, which is also resulting in the book that's outside. Just, the art of dreaming, we've actually lost that art. No? We don't do any dreaming anymore. We're so bogged down with our daily life and being practical and realistic that we don't do that. So this was an attempt at trying to get people to dream India's future in 2100. And then come back down to earth and actually talk about pathways of getting there. And finally, a more global website, which in fact Pallav is managing, which we started a few months back. Again, similarly documenting radical alternatives from different parts of the world, which is going to partly result in a book coming out in a few months called Pluriverse, 110 essays from around the world of radical alternatives. So keep a lookout for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashish. That gave us hope, yes. You were right that if you feel depressed, you should look at this stuff. So Johanna, would love to hear from you now.
Yeah, so I thought I'd bring you back down for a moment first, but but Ashish, thank you so much, and it really is really inspiring to hear some of these stories on the ground in India. But as many of you know by, and being here today is kind of indicative of that you might have a similar view, but right now, currently we have a pretty extractive energy economy. It's truly the communities who are least off that are ones that are burdened with our infrastructure, with our pollution, and with climate change now. And it's really not a new phenomena in a lot of ways. It's been one that's been happening for decades, decades upon decades. You can look to, also from the Netherlands, you can look to Shell and see kind of pretty consistent, egregious behavior across the world and extractive experiences. And I think that even if you're looking in the US and you're looking to a power plant, for instance, you'll find that you'll see that it's actually higher rates of Black communities than even low-income communities. That's a better indicator for a power plant being in a community than even it being low-income. So shows kind of this extractive tendency, and to bring it kind of close to home, if you look at Virginia, I don't know how many people live in Virginia here, but there's Dominion Power, which is the large utility that is a monopoly in the area. And they are laying down pipes for natural gas. They often are dumping coal ash in low-income communities. They really have kind of captured their ratepayers in a lot of ways too, and are finding ways to kind of make money off of them for their shareholders. And so it's a really kind of close to home experience, and where you can see kind of fossil fuel industry and like the electrical industry writ large taking advantage of and exploiting our system. And for me, I think that it shows that this isn't just a technological fix. It really is about kind of the outsized influence that these companies can have, and how our political system and economic system facilitate that in a lot of ways. And so for me, I think that there are kind of two reasons that we have to deal with the political and economic systemic issues in order to tackle climate change. And the first one is, if we don't do it, there's the feeling that these corporations could still have a dominating effect, and the priorities will stay the same, and we could potentially be situated in a place where we're at business as usual. But second, let's say we get the technological fixes that we need. We move from that fossil fuel system to one based on renewables. That doesn't per se mean that it's no longer extractive. And, you know, you can see that there's going to, you know, workers may not be getting, and already we're seeing this in renewables, that they're less likely to be unionized, and you can see that there are large for-profit entities that are taking advantage of the renewable situation and aren't bringing not bringing the wealth to the local communities. So, in my mind, it's both a means and an end, this political and economic system change. And I really think that energy democracy, in a lot of ways, provides us the opportunity to build that system. It's both about resisting fossil fuels and stopping fossil fuels from coming out of the ground, and also about building a world where we have our renewables that puts communities in control of them and is distributing wealth equitably and is providing opportunity. And even though we have to transition rapidly to deal with the climate change issue, we have to just design those structures so that they are for enable democracy and equity. And I think that energy democracy means a lot of different things to different people. It's at once a value system, it's a set of goals to achieve, it's also a movement in and of itself. It's a way to identify, and it will take, in order to get to energy democracy, a diversity of tactics. The ways that I've really thought about energy democracy and the research that I've done, and looking at different ways people are conceptualizing it, is breaking it into kind of three interconnected categories. The first one being that technological component of fossil fuels to renewables, and there's nuance there, obviously, because different types of renewables provide different, democratization opportunities. The second one is the political, and so the political, how can we instill democracy into the structures we're building for our new energy system, and building both, creating transparency, providing really genuine participation and engagement, and really thinking through who's in the room, who's not in the room, and also if they're not there, why are they not? And so, how can we ensure that we're providing the opportunities for engagement? And then also, accountability and setting up accountability structures. The third piece is the economic one. So ownership, who owns our energy? Are communities the ones that are in charge of it? Who's getting the wealth from those? Another piece is kind of the redistribution of wealth and how it's distributed. Is it just for-profit corporations and utilities that are being able to aggregate wealth and leaving the least off, continuing to re-perpetuate that situation? And also a just transition for workers. I think that's really key to the economic point of energy democracy, is providing opportunities for transition, and also ensuring that the new system we build has good jobs that have family sustaining wages, that are unionized and are providing those things. So that's kind of a way that I look at energy democracy, and particularly my research has been focused on municipalization and municipal utilities. So those that are owned by the local government and are brought down to that local level, not these investor-owned kind of large-scale monopolies that you'll find across the United States and Europe, those being the two that I definitely know best myself. And the reasons why I think municipal utilities could provide one of the avenues towards energy democracy and can be integrated with other energy democracy tactics, such as cooperative ownership of renewables and solar cooperatives, is because it creates democratic accountability. It can help to fulfill those kind of three, the technological shift that can be facilitated by the community members, and they'll have more opportunity for action, and imbuing equity within the vision of and the goals of that utility. I also think that it can potentially provide us with scale. When you have municipalized utilities, what you can do is transition entire cities at once, and think, about how we decentralize our renewable energy system and ensure that ownership is with local communities, but also if there is need for rapid transition and providing potentially larger scale solar, you can do it in a way that it's still owned by the community and operated by them and providing local jobs. And so that is something that I think is compelling about this particular component or tactic within the energy democracy deck of opportunities. And already a lot of utilities in the United States are publicly owned, or even have democratic structures within them. One being publicly owned utilities, municipalized utilities. The other one being rural electric cooperatives that, back in, I think it's the 19-teens, 1920s, there was a true need for electrification in rural areas, and investor-owned utilities just really weren't willing to go into those areas. And so rural electric cooperatives were started, and so those are run and operated by farmers and local, rural communities. And so we have 30% of the United States that's run off of these types of democratically governed utilities, and I think that speaks to a lot of power that we can already start to transition these municipal utilities, make them more democratic, engender more of this, more energy democracy, as well as starting campaigns and working towards remunicipalization or municipalization in other cities. And you're seeing that a lot in Europe. There are really, really incredible examples of remunicipalization that have happened recently. Munich is a really good example. Munich as a totally publicly owned grid and energy generator. They now provide 100% renewable energy to Munich, and it is democratically governed, owned by the city. They also have tried to integrate and ensure that low-income community members have, have weatherization that happens, so that you're ensuring that everyone within the community continues to have access to energy. Hamburg is another German city that recently went through this transition to a municipalized energy utility, and it was really instigated out of a rejection of fossil fuels, and particularly a rejection of a pipeline that then brought people together and said, well, we have to deal with our energy system writ large, and we have to stop this stuff from coming into our neighborhood. And so now in the law that was passed for Hamburg, it says that it has to be a socially just and democratically governed utility for energy. And in the United States, we have also municipalization projects going on, both in Boulder, Colorado. There's another one that I just learned about the other day that's happening in Iowa. So there's definitely activation and energy around this that I think could be one of the many tactics to move forward. So I guess I will maybe stop at that moment, and I'm sure that Basa will have wonderful questions, and I'm excited to dialogue with Ashish about some of these options and move forward.
Thank you so much, Johanna. What we're going to do for a little while here is I have some questions for our speakers, both ones that have come up with earlier and ones that occurred to me right now listening to the two of you. And then, don't worry, you will get a chance to ask questions and engage in conversation with them as well. I'll hold myself to maybe maximum half an hour and then open it up to all of you. So, to start with, Ashish, you talk about different structures that are at the root of our, of our crises of oppression, and you mentioned patriarchy, capitalism, statism, etc. So, couple of follow-up questions on that. One is, can you explain how these structures are intertwined and how they reinforce each other? And secondly, particularly for an American audience, the concept of statism as something oppressive may be a little unfamiliar, so if you can explain that a little bit.
Okay, maybe the second one first. So, statism, essentially, to put it very simply, is a system in which the nation state dominates decision making and takes upon itself the powers of deciding on what is to happen where and for whom. Now, if it is a democratically elected nation state, one assumes that they will be responsible in the way they are dispensing this power or using this power. But as we know from across the world, even the most progressive revolutionary states, as in, for instance, some of the Latin American ones or Greece or whatever, that has not been the case. And so it seems to be in the logic of the nation state or the centralized state that once the power is there, it actually gets alienated from the people, and you actually move away from what should be a real democracy. So that's what one can broadly call statism or state-dominated systems. In the last 15-20 years, and again just from our experience in India, these various forms of the concentration of power seem to be coming together. We increasingly see, for instance, and we've documented it a lot in this book, what is being called crony capitalism, which is where the powerful in the state are kind of hand in glove with the powerful corporations. There is often a revolving door process in which CEOs will be ex-government officers or will be in the World Bank and the IMF, and those government officers will be in the World Bank and IMF, and then they come back to being government officers, bureaucrats, and so on. So it's like it's a pretty nice, cozy, not necessarily always harmonious, but still a cozy circle that forms. And you will see that in the form of not just sort of revolving door, rotation door, but also things like policy making. Who's actually influencing policy? So, for instance, in India, we increasingly see that government committees, which are formed for making policy, have much more people from the private corporations than from independent civil society. So that's one way in which at least these two powerful, the statism and the capitalism, is kind of coming together. There are a lot of eco-feminists or feminists who actually would say that both statism and capitalism actually emerged from ancient patriarchy anyway. And we will see that in most of these, the top decision-making is still mostly men. Or mostly masculinist patriarchal ways of taking decisions that are still very much dominant there. So for instance, what gets computed in the economy, GDP as an example, completely ignores the reproductive and productive labor of women, whether it's in the household or it's in many different forms. So that's the sort of confluence of those three that come together. Then in India, you will actually also see that the topmost rungs of government and corporations are mostly people from the privileged castes. Dalits, the example I gave of so-called outcasts or untouchables, very rarely are in those positions. You might find the odd individual who's kind of politically fought his or her way there, but otherwise it's as a caste, it's mostly still those who were traditionally dominant. So that's where you actually then bring even casteism comes in. I guess in a country like India it would be a racist phenomenon in ways. So in the last 20-30 years of globalization, I think this coming together is way more powerful than perhaps it was in the past. Or at least it's that much more dominating of our lives than it was in the past.
And similar question, I guess, for you. On your website, I saw this very interesting thing where when you're talking about municipalization as a tactic for community control, you refer to its power and shortcomings. Can you elaborate a little bit on how municipal control can increase accountability of energy systems but doesn't always do so, and what those limitations are?
Right, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, and I think that it really has a lot to do with the design of the utility and therefore of the democratic and economic structures imbued within the utility. And I think that there are incredible examples and powerful examples of how places like Munich or Hamburg have really used their municipal campaigns and then subsequent utilities to transition their cities really effectively. And even in the United States, you'll also see cities like LA even has a municipal utility that has pretty fast-paced transition to renewable energy and projects for that. And they have they have boards that then have more participatory components to them. Nebraska is a really interesting case. Nebraska is a state that only has public utilities in it. And so it's just an intriguing case study for how municipal utilities and public utilities could work in their own kind of vacuum. And I think that that's where you see the power of it. They have relatively lower costs. Their costs are the revenues that they do are going right back into their communities and are helping pay for their public transport or their schools instead of going off to shareholders. And so that's a really powerful thing in my mind. But not all democratic structures are created equal. I think that that's really, really important that we ensure that there's equity and there are those opportunities for effective engagement. And to give you an example of a municipal utility that may have failed on energy democracy, for instance, there is a municipal utility in Arizona that the way that they vote for the people who are on their board is by the amount of acreage of land that they have. And it's done at a time of year that's different from any other election cycle. So they have something like, I think it's a 2% turnout rate. So not much democracy in that. Definitely not. And it continues to perpetuate that situation with big landowners. More often than not, white men are the ones that have the power. And you'll also see this pretty consistently in rural electric cooperatives too. They have tried very hard, particularly when it was based, I think when they were coming together, it was mostly white men, white male farmers who had access. They particularly tried to push black farmers out of the conversation and have kind of continued to do that ever since. And so now you see that the people who are running these are have been in charge for a very long time, have a lot of vested interests, and it's running more like an investor-owned utility in a lot of ways that equity and that democracy is gone. But I don't think that means that, I think there's a lot of hope though, because I think people are starting to recognize that they could use these municipal utilities or these rural electric cooperatives to shift and that they could actually, if they take this opportunity and they can change some of these, the laws, or ultimately determine what the rates are going to look like. And a great example of that would be in Omaha Public Power District in Nebraska. They have a board of 8 elected members that come from the community. It's, one person, one vote, a much better system than the Arizona one. And what happened, though, is that the utility set up this rate that essentially increased the fixed costs. And they said, hey, if you have a bill of $150 a month, the amount that you pay isn't going to change. But the reality is, if you are a low-income person that is, not using as much energy, your rates are going to go up because you just have this fixed price. You can't go below it. So it's very regressive, and it definitely did not, it was not inclusive, and it didn't consider equity at all. And so it became an economic justice issue for people. And so the community and climate activists took this up and now have been able to transition. They're working on kind of pulling back this fixed price cost. And then they now have 2 new people who took over the board and are very focused on getting the Omaha Public Power District to 100% renewable and to kind of rolling back these types of fixed price costs. And that is just a really good example of how you can take back power in a municipal utility or a rural electric cooperative. One additional example I'll give of that is in a rural electric cooperative. There's a group called Our Voices in Mississippi that kind of realize that people don't know that they own their electric cooperative, and so they don't know that they have this power. And so they brought together particularly low-income and minority voices to essentially organize them, educate them, and let them know what their opportunities were, and are now working on campaigns to get people elected into board positions in the rural electric cooperatives, and also take their vote seriously and participate and expand opportunities for engagement there, which is really, really powerful.
So what I hear you saying essentially is that even if the model of democracy in a municipally owned utility is flawed, if it exists, there's more of an opportunity to democratize it as against if it were investor owned.
Exactly.
Right.
I would definitely say that. And I think that public utilities just generally also, their reason for being is so different. The reason for being a public utility is to provide access to the community members. You're owned by them, and that's who you're finally, at the end of the day, who you have to speak to. An investor-owned utility, it's absolutely for the shareholders. And, the way that they make money as shareholders is capital investments in infrastructure, which more likely than not is pipelines.
Thank you, Johanna. And another question for you, Ashish. So listening to your presentation, one thing that occurred to me is that communities that are experimenting with these forms of radical democratization in the political space, in the space of food, ecology, energy, water, education, etc. And are localizing to the extent possible, relying less on resources from the outside, are also making themselves more resilient in the face of potential disasters. Can you elaborate a little bit on ways in which they may be making themselves more resilient? And I was thinking of this especially as I was listening to you. I was thinking of Puerto Rico and what they went through after the hurricane, and how different it could have been if there was more community control.
I think there's at least 2 or 3 ways in which greater resilience is being built in. One is promoting, sustaining diversity, both in the biological or biophysical sense and in the cultural sense. I mean, just to give an example of agriculture, if you have 10 varieties of rice in your community, the chances are when a drought hits or a flood hits or climate change, climate crisis happens, at least 4 or 5 of those varieties might still respond to the situation. Whereas if you had switched to one hybrid variety given by a corporation or a government, and if that gets hit by a pest or a drought or a flood situation, then you're gone, finished. You don't have the resilience that diversity of, in this case, seed diversity gives you. The same thing I think with cultural and knowledge diversity. That the ability of people to respond to crises and disasters is much greater if there are different forms of knowledge available with that community. Both their own traditional diverse forms and also maybe what they're getting from modern systems. As against, again, where you might have a monoculture of knowledge that may not be able to survive a particular disaster or event of that kind. So, I don't know the Puerto Rican situation, but I do know that, for instance, Himalayan communities currently are facing enormous problems because of climate change and other factors. And one of the main reasons why at least some of them are still surviving is because they have that diversity of biophysical systems and knowledge systems in place. And they're able to use that. And now they become actually conscious adaptive mechanisms also. For instance, in Peru, in the Andes near Cusco, there's something called the Parque de la Papa, which is the potato park. The Quechua community is deliberately rebuilding its diversity of potato and trying it out in different heights of some 600 or 700 varieties of potato, because they know that with the climate crisis, some things that used to grow at this height don't grow there anymore, but they might grow at a higher or a lower height. And it's only if they have that diversity of potatoes and of the knowledge relating to them that they'll be able to withstand the kind of changes taking place. So I think it's that resilience that's really crucial.
And in a way, that diversity of both like plant and animal species and of cultures in a way mimics nature, mimics ecology.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in a way it mimics, let's say, a rainforest or a natural diverse system which is able to withstand shocks much more than a plantation, for instance.
So, Johanna, this is following up on something you were talking about. So, the food justice movement has moved from talking about food security to talking about food sovereignty. Do you see a similar movement in the energy democracy movement from energy security to energy sovereignty?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting allegory, and I think that, yes, I think more and more we're seeing communities recognize the power of having your own energy and being the one that's producing it, and the opportunities that provides both in, creating, sustaining energy, and also the opportunity, if you have even more energy, to give it back in some ways. And I think that communities are really coming together in a lot of places, and there are solar gardens that are being implemented in cities and more rural areas as well, and it has created an opportunity for cooperative learning and engagement in a way that I think is really interesting and has a lot of opportunity moving forward. And I think it is really key to how we build out a distributed energy system that also has resiliency if we are, as we are also fighting climate change as well. In Vermont a while ago, we were hit by Hurricane Irene. Absolutely nothing close to what happened in Puerto Rico, but it was this moment where a lot of rural communities were, left in the dark. And so now we have in one area in Rutland, Vermont, a microgrid that has been started that was with a church and the local government there. And that was, it provides energy for a school, but it also ensures that, if we lose power at any point, there's a place in the community that people can go and they know that they can rely on, and they can have food, they can, be warm, and all these different things that are important as we are thinking more and more about resiliency.
And finally, I have a question for both of you. Sorry, it's the Trump question, but more putting it in a broader global context. There has been almost worldwide resurgence of far-right politics, and that's happening both inside and outside of government. Inside of governments, you have the Trump regime in this country, you have the government in India, you have the authoritarian regime in the Philippines, etc. But then likewise, outside of government, there are far-right movements, particularly across Europe. So, do you see this emergence of a far-right as a threat to the kind of long-term democratic transformation work that you do, and why or why not? Ashish, you want to address that first?
Well, yeah, simple answer to the last part of the question is yes. Of course it's a threat, it's a huge threat, I would say probably the most, well not the, but certainly one of the most important threats that we face. In India, we've always had a far right, but in the last few years it's become especially prominent and more visible and more sort of bolder, because it's, if not actively encouraged, it is definitely not discouraged by the current government. So it's a threat, absolutely. I mean, it's a threat, I think, in an ecological sense, because obviously they're like extremely neoliberal in what they're saying, but I think much more so in terms of the social cohesion of society. It's extremely, I mean, the whole religious intolerance stuff in India, the attacks on Dalits and so on that's been happening. And I get across the world you're seeing similar stuff. I think the more tricky question is why is it happening and how does one respond to it? My very partial understanding of why it's happening, I think maybe pointing to some solutions also, which is that I think economic globalization actually disprivileges so many sections of society, including those who think that they have the representatives who keep them in power. So for instance, let's say the working class whites across North America and Europe are badly affected also by economic globalization, because this economic globalization is simply not able to provide the decent livelihoods that they should be, that they need. Just as much as it's disprivileging the blacks and the indigenous peoples and so on and so forth. And so a right wing which actually comes in and says, hey, listen, it's the Muslims who are taking away your jobs, it's the blacks who are taking away your jobs, or in our Indian case, it's the Bangladeshis who are taking away your jobs, is a nice simple explanation that goes straight to the heart of these people who are being disprivileged, and they will then vote for that right-wing party. People like us who go in and say, hey, listen, we need to look at the structural roots of the inequalities that you're facing. They go to sleep and they say, well, bye-bye. So I think we need to be able to figure out ways by which we say that, look, here's another way of creating jobs which everybody can benefit from, which is decent, which is dignified, which doesn't cost the earth, and to give examples of this kind, to say, look, this is what, and so the quiet work that we, or maybe not so quiet work that we need to do with these dispossessed communities from all sections of society is really about how does one recreate economic systems and political systems that provide dignified, meaningful livelihoods and lives to people. And I think the more we can do that, the more we can show examples of that happening through whatever visual and audiovisual and other communication techniques that we have, the more the possibility of actually positively engaging with these people and kind of in some sense winning them back from the extreme right wing that has currently occupied their hearts and brains. I think that's a very partial answer, obviously, and a simplistic one, but I think we need to do much more at that front.
No, it goes in exactly the the deep kind of thinking that we need to be doing, and it occurred to me. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the example of Bangladeshis in India. From what I've seen, going back to India very frequently to visit family, from what I've seen, that the discourse around Bangladeshi migrants in India is very similar to the discourse around undocumented immigrants in this country, the same kind of racism. And migration to survive is very much a global phenomenon. I mean, I've met undocumented Cambodian workers, for example, in Bangkok. So, everywhere where you have a relatively more affluent country and a relatively poorer country, you see these flows of migrants, and these kind of right-wingers are exploiting that to create divisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would love to hear your response to this as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to mirror both of you in a lot of ways. Coming both from the United States, but also the Netherlands, we have his name is Geert Wilders, who is a very far right person, our political operative, and then we also have a new young group that's coming through called the Forum for Democracy that is just about a year old and is gaining incredible traction, especially with young people in the Netherlands. And so it is something that just absolutely needs to be addressed, and finding the opportunities to do so is imperative. And actually, a friend of the Democracy Collaborative and a Next System project, Andrew Cumbers from the University of Glasgow, has been doing a little bit of analysis on this phenomena and looking particularly at economic marginalization and how it can be associated with these far-right tendencies. And he found that, when you have indicators such as like cooperative ownership, trade unions have less influence, and there are fewer workplace rights, people are kind of flocking more towards these far-right parties. And so I think that really speaks to your point, Ashish, that people are looking for a new system. They are, but in some ways they're looking in the wrong spot. And it might be very much, hey, they'll look at the structural issues here. It's a little bit harder than finding the person right next to you. And so it is finding ways to address that effectively. And, I think working on building community wealth from the city and creating jobs that are good and will be there for a long time, and corporations can't come up and leave is a really key component. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Please join me in giving a very big hand to our and I want to open it up, and you have 45 minutes for questions. Your hand first.
Sure.
You may not have been the first.
Right. So the examples you gave, the inspirational examples, either in Vidarbha or, the women, the Dalit women, what was the catalyst? Was it a leader? Was it, what was it that caused that to happen? And how does one replicate, or can one replicate that, or does it have to be replicated by itself? I mean, what's the...
I think it's extremely diverse. Catalyst could be crises of some kinds, which somebody then responds to. The catalyst could also be seeing that they're going in a direction where somebody else has already suffered a lot. So just the information of what has happened somewhere else could actually say, could lead a community to be more take more proactive sort of preventive action. There's different kinds of motivations that work there. But in terms of who or how something starts, yes, leadership is one very crucial factor that we have seen. Now that leadership doesn't necessarily have to be a single individual. It can be a youth group or a women's group or somebody from outside who comes and catalyzes something, or somebody from within the community who is able to do it. The second very important factor is often, not always, but often some kind of civil society presence. And this is not because the community by itself doesn't have the capacity, but because through history they have actually been incapacitated. And because the threats they often face are from outside. So a civil society organization or individual who comes in and is able to create the opportunity for them to rebuild that capacity, to learn, to get information of what's happening outside, to know what a certain policy means and so on, or a certain industrial project means, is very crucial in being able to create the conditions for mobilization. Another thing could be that they've actually already faced a threat, like in the case of that Central Indian village, they faced the threat of the dam. They mobilized against it, and that was completely an internal mobilization, nobody from outside involved. But in that mobilization, they realized that they need to sustain this over a much longer time for a whole bunch of things and not just the anti-dam movement. So there's really many, many different factors. There's no one. We actually have if you look at our website, we have a synthesis of analysis of 140 cases of community-led conservation. So it's not all these different fields of work, but just looking at conservation of nature led by communities, which gives such much more detail in terms of what has been the motivations, what are the catalysts, who has led the process, what have been the factors of success and or failure, etc. So I can point you to that as being one analysis that we have.
Okay, so both of you were talking about localization, like localization of efforts and localization of energy. One hand that is there, and then the other hand we are talking about like globalization, in the sense like we want people, we are seeing immigrants coming from one country to another. So don't you see that there is a disconnect, because we think our food should be locally grown, our energy should be locally grown, and then there will be like people coming from outside. So because from my own research, like I have seen like the same people who talk about localization, they also don't like immigrants coming to their communities. So I was just thinking, like, what do you think about that?
You go for it.
Yeah, I think, Parijata, that this is why actually a lot of our movements are talking about open localization. Because you're right, there is a certain right wing which also talks about localization, which is anti-immigrant kind of discourse, and we definitely dissociate ourselves from that. There's two aspects to this. One is to say that we can localize our basic needs, but also be able to accommodate those who really need it, who are refugees who are coming in from outside. And you see that, for instance, in Greece, there are a number of movements where even in the midst of the worst economic crisis that they're going through, you have movements of localization for food, for energy, for water, where refugees were welcome. It's the most amazing stuff, and you have the rich countries which are actually saying we don't want refugees, whereas these are, they don't have surplus riches and all of that, but they're still able to actually manage to do that. That's one crucial aspect. The second crucial aspect is that if we're talking about open localization, we're also saying in the long run process, people wherever they're coming from also have to be facilitated to rebuild their lives. So they actually don't need to be refugees and coming into another country. Now I'm not talking about war situations and all, that's a whole different ballgame. That also we can talk about. But I'm saying even, for instance, economic distress that causes people to move from a village to a city or from one region or one country to another country, that economic distress cannot be solved by us pouring in aid and stuff like that. but actually saying how do you rebuild that local economy and local society and local polity in a way that they actually will want to go back. So in India, we now have actually reverse migration taking place. So where villages have been able to revive their economies and create more socially dignified life, people have come back to the village. So that's the kind of response one would give, which is very different from the right-wing localization, xenophobic kind of stuff.
Yeah, question for you. You gave this example of how village communities become more independent and take the power and the control of their own lives. How does this at the state level? How do they react and do they push back against this independence? And in parallel, in your examples also, I wanted to know. How does it happen when these cities, for example, in Germany, take over the control over the energy utilities? Do they get pushback from the corporations or whoever owned these utilities before, and how is that handled?
You go first.
Yeah, of course. I think that the investor-owned utilities are pissed, to be completely honest. And that's why, for instance, in Boulder, Colorado, in the United States, where there's been a campaign, it's been since 2011 that they've been working on it, because Xcel Energy has pretty consistently tried to find ways to stop it. And you also saw this in Berlin. Berlin was a place that they had hoped to and has been really at the forefront of a lot of energy democracy thinking, and tried to get a municipalization to happen, but there was a lot of pushback. You know, even the city itself, they were unsure if they wanted to take this on, and so then they hedged and tried to push people away from the concept and idea. So it's definitely getting pushed back. I absolutely think that that's something that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to need smart campaigns and good people and good organizers thinking through how we can come up against these for-profit entities and their vested interests in keeping like entire cities under, that's how they make their money.
So I think one thing that's very crucial is how much of a threat does the existing system feel from any of these alternatives. If it's small scale, relatively, they tend to tolerate saying, okay, that's fine, it's not really threatening me as a corporation or me as a government. When it gets to either a scale or a quality which begins to threaten that power, that's where the pushback begins to happen. So for instance, in the city I'm in, several thousand waste picker women have formed a union and a cooperative, and they have negotiated with the municipal government to actually take at least half of the city's, to deal with half of the city's waste. They wanted the whole city, and they could have easily dealt with it, but the other half, the private corporation that was dealing with the waste, which is really doing a horrible job of it, but they pushed really hard, and they managed to get the municipal government to give them at least half of that contract. So or for instance, alternative currencies. So many places in North America and Europe have alternative or community currencies. When they're small, nobody really pushes back on them, and they become big, like Bristol Pound, which is across Bristol in the UK. Then corporations and governments start wondering, maybe we need to do something about this and make sure that they're using the British pound and not the Bristol pound. So really it's about how threatened they feel. But when they do, there is pushback, and that pushback can sometimes be extremely brutal, with people getting killed and so on. So one has to be ready for that.
My question is related to this one and the responses that you've given. We often think of culture containing a value of solidarity, and we try to mobilize it and remind people of that cultural value. But in fact, the dominant economic system rewards people differently. And so unions are often co-opted by the process of resisting municipalization or worker democracy. Even when the union uses worker democracy terms, they don't actually mean it in the community sense, the universal sense. And I'm wondering what are good examples of strategies for building the concept of solidarity. When I look at the examples in the democracy collaborative, they often seem to be not strategic institutions. They're not the ones that are really driving the economy. The example of laundry service in Cleveland didn't seem to me to be the most strategic institution for promoting economic democracy. And yet I'm struck by the idea that when you choose more strategic institutions, you're inviting, you're creating a greater threat, in a sense, to the economic elites. So is there a tendency to sort of focus on the things you can pull off and avoid the more strategic institutions that would really benefit more people if they were run with a common good balance sheet instead of a private criteria of profit that even workers in the industry could be easily co-opted by?
Yeah, so I guess to talk about a little bit about the Democracy Collaborative and the evergreen models that are out there with the co-ops. I think one of the reasons that the laundry we may have thought of as strategic is because we are working with these what we call anchor institutions of these large-scale nonprofit entities that actually do take up a significant amount of a city's economy, like a hospital or like a university. And in this particular case, actually, a laundry service is a big need of a hospital. And so to provide jobs within that sector then allows for, an opportunity for laundry, and laundry mats have pretty consistently been pretty horrible places to work. So then providing one that is, rooted in kind of ensuring that it's ecologically sound, and then also incorporates economic democracy, and is it can garner the contracts with such a large economic entity. I think that was kind of the strategic thinking behind it, and as very much a pilot of what this could look like, and the expansion of this model in places that maybe people don't think of a worker co-op being at this point in time. So that's, I think, a little bit about what I think about in that context.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm seeing a lot of parallels, a lot of sort of dichotomies in these discussions. The other one that came to me was when you were talking about the power of diversity, and for resilience, and therefore the power of information sharing, on a global scale, to get to the kinds of solutions that will work locally, and also. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how you have promoted that kind of information sharing, which is close to my heart, because we have an information sharing collaborative. So,
is that something you'd like to add?
Well, I think from my point of view, and maybe also briefly in response to what you said, in terms of replication, I think it's a mistake to think that we can actually replicate something somewhere in terms of when we're sharing the information, it's of course the practice of how one does one thing, etc., is really crucial to be able to inspire. But if you want to say that, okay, if this thing has worked here in terms of self-governance or energy democracy or whatever, it's not exactly the same thing that's going to work somewhere else. There's cultural, ecological, political differences. economic differences. But I think what's important in terms of information sharing, therefore, is what are the processes that worked? What are the lessons that can be learned from the processes? What if there were failures, why were there failures? The successes, why were there successes? What are the values, like those values that and principles that I put up there? For me, actually, if one does global sharing of information on successful, radical, alternative, transformative alternatives, it's really about that. So if one is to learn from the Zapatista movement in Mexico, then it's really, again, there's no way we can actually replicate a Zapatista in India. So there's now 800 villages in central India that have just recently declared autonomy, okay, from the government. Not independence, but autonomy from the government. And by the way, there's a huge pushback from the state on that. They're moving armed police into that region. 800 villages is large. So, but the principles of the Zapatista, which actually say, okay, leadership is by following, etc., the whole bunch of them. That's what could actually be possibly used here, and maybe some of what these people are doing could be used over there to be able to learn. So I think we need to promote much more of that kind of sharing of, I would say, sharing of wisdom rather than information.
Which is what you had in your slides and all, were the common values, the common principles.
Yeah, so I mean, for instance, if we have the Radical Ecological Democracy website or any of the others that might be available there, the stories for inspiration, of course, but also the sharing of lessons and principles and values, that would be really valuable to my mind.
Yeah, and to build off of that just one little bit, I think within a democracy collaborative context, one thing, the evergreen model has been one major thing that we've brought to the table, and that was based off of Mondragon in a lot of ways. And then from evergreen, we've seen that model built upon in Preston in the UK, and they've made it even better, and have integrated more of their community so that it's like really based on community wealth and bringing things, building economic vitality in a locally based way, and we've just seen that there's another example of something similar to Mondragon, Preston, and Evergreen in Victoria, in Australia. And so I think that that's seeing these models and seeing the values that we talk about on a daily basis play out in practical terms. And I think this gets to a little bit of what Ashish was saying as well, is so helpful to kind of vision for yourself how you could make it happen in your local community.
No, I think that's good. I'm thinking about all that's been said and presented in this session, and so in the spirit of good conversation and serendipity, let's say, for instance, I was to meet somebody far right from the Indian regime, and maybe somebody of Trump's regime, and I sat down with them at a coffee table, right? In your words, what would you tell them in a minute or two?
Ooh, a minute or two? It's like our elevator speech is not to be on the far right. Like
just imagine. I'm saying, think for a second. If you had the chance to have a decent conversation with somebody who maybe politically or ideologically or fundamentally you disagree with, but could have a cordial conversation, what is it that you would say?
Yeah.
And how would you keep it cordial and maybe keep the conversation going to maybe lead to something productive?
And there's this approach of deliberative democracy which really focuses on that whole kind of exchange to where people have an opportunity, things are objectively presented and people actually have the structure and an opportunity to hear, and to listen.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, and I think that honestly I would start with a question and trying to get down to the root of what is the problem here. Is it about migration, but why is it that you feel that immigration is such a big issue for you? Is it because of your job? Is it because of your security? And try to whittle down to the values that are the things that are creating this nerves and this reactionary experience for them. And then from there, I think that is something that my opinion, you can build up from and say, okay, well, if it is really economic security, let's think about like what are the ways that we can actually ensure that there is a job guarantee, or there are these things that are in place, and I think that's the way that I would try to come at that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, and maybe share stories. So, for instance, we're having coffee together. Let's say, okay, do you know that in San Salvador there's actually a cooperative that grows coffee in which everybody gets decent jobs, and it's a fair trade coffee, etc., whatever. I don't know. So, I mean, depending on the context, one would probably share stories that are inspiring, which don't threaten either me or that person, and might generate an interesting, oh really, that's how they're generating their jobs. So, I mean, that's really about, say, livelihoods in terms of immigrants and migration, I guess, the kind of approach that Johanna spoke about. So, it won't be possible in 1 or 2 minutes. But if you got half an hour, then perhaps one can do it. And I think we'd also have to learn non-violent communication.
Right.
Because I know that faced with a person like that, I might actually get into a fight. And so I have to figure out for myself how I can actually not get into a fight and be able to have a decent conversation where I stay calm and hopefully the other person stays calm, and then maybe we get somewhere.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you touched very briefly on local currencies, and I was wondering if you had any experience, any stories that you could share on localized or community banking. Because I mean, I've read the studies that show when you buy services or goods from people in the local economy, much more of that money stays in the local economy as opposed to shopping at a big box store or some multinational corporation. How does that fit into the change that we're trying to bring about?
Okay, so
Go for it. No.
Nobody wants that one.
No. Community bank, we can talk for days.
Yeah. There's so many great examples actually around the world of community currencies and banking, not necessarily in terms of setting up banks, but in setting up systems of sharing and holding the wealth in a certain sense collectively. And I'm not talking about the microcredit stuff that somebody got a Nobel Prize for. I'm talking about much more community-owned, community-led systems of sharing credit and sharing wealth and so on. There's lots and lots of it, but I think, and so you can probably speak more about them from this context. What I find equally or even more revolutionary actually is the sharing of non-monetary based exchange systems, time banking, for instance, or time sharing. I mean, I think Ithaca was one of the first ones that I knew of from like 20, 30 years back.
Even in Virginia, there is dancing rabbit, so it's very close to.
Yes, UK has what's it called? Something Spice Network, which has 30,000 people across the country sharing their services and goods without any money being exchanged. Or I don't know if any of us here is on couch sharing. You can go virtually anywhere in the world and get a free bed, and how does that work? It works on the currency of trust, not on money. So I think, and in some senses, some of these are actually going back to old systems of barter and exchange which were there. Now, they may have been exploitative in a certain sense in the past, but you can build new forms of that. So I think there's incredibly amazing examples. I've seen schools in Greece, for instance, that are run on time sharing, where parents are giving half their time to teach the kids, and so on. I mean, there's lots of such stuff. So again, how do we give these examples more visibility? Show them as inspiring stories is our challenge.
Yeah, I absolutely would advocate for a public bank. I think, we're 10 years out from the crash, and I think that all we've seen is consolidation of power continually within the banking sector, and it's just inevitable that there will be another one, and that's because of absolutely many reasons, and this continual consolidation of power, there is constant redlining and investments in things that we just do not need to be investing in. And so public banks, I think, could provide more democratized avenues to lending and ensure that we're reinvesting in our communities. And they can be avenues for the transition, but also affordable housing in cities. And I know that there is a campaign in DC that's the divest from Wells Fargo, reinvest in our communities, DCRI. That is a really good example of how people are starting to think of this, because the Wells Fargo just can't be the answer for our for our banking and for how we're exchanging money. And I think bringing it back into the public sector is one of the key things that we can do.
Just look up Faircoin and Fairbank. It's two very interesting things that a guy called Enrique Duran, who took €500,000 from Spanish banks and refused to give it back, spread it out to all sorts of small cooperative organizations. He's of course on the run, he can't go back into Spain. But he then has started something called Faircoin and Fairbank, which is to be able to link up local currency systems across different parts of the world and have non-interest based banking system, because the interest is one of the biggest problems with the way the banking system runs.
And the kind of cooperative economies that Ashish and Johanna talked about are the real sharing economy, as against some fake Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who claim to be creating a sharing economy. Okay.
I had a question, actually. You had brought up the issue about microgrids being owned by local government, and so we had a circumstance where the private utility actually came to our village board and suggested that a generator, large generator, be put in. And people got very enthused about this until they found out that this microgrid was just going to be going over to the commercial area. So it was going to keep the supermarket open, and it was going to be there for the businesses. But when people asked, well, will I be able to get my electric lights if we have another major storm? The answer was, oh no. And the circumstance, that was very interesting to see that the community actually said, we don't want you to take down our trees in our open space in order to do this, because there is not enough benefit to the full community. So I think this is one of those areas, and they sort of went away very disappointed, because where did these people come up with this idea about a common community? Well, I live in Columbia, Maryland, so we got that from James Rouse, and we still believe it. So it's very interesting how these ideas can be presented. Now, my question is, could we have gone back to the utility and said something, or how could we have gotten them interested in both providing for the commercial and providing for our community, for the residents as well? How do you take a situation, to me, it's sort of a lost opportunity, because we didn't really know how to parlay that into a more extensive conversation. So do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, ideas about that. I mean, the first thing I want to say is similar. Microgrids are not always great. Microgrids can absolutely be co-opted by private entities and be incredibly exclusive. Because if you create a situation, and this is something I've been thinking a little bit, as Puerto Rico has been thinking about how they rebuild their system, if it's all microgrids and it's only based on who can pay for them, you're going to be in a situation where you're cutting people off from energy, and that's absolutely unacceptable if you're trying to achieve energy democracy. So I'm really glad that you brought up that example. With regards to what you say, I mean, I think that there should be some type of, type of regulation that requires in some ways, if you're putting in a microgrid, that a certain amount of it is accessible to residences, or, creating some safeguards that enable equity, so that, it isn't that only the very rich areas of the neighborhood and the commercial areas are the ones that keep the lights on when we have a hurricane that comes through, because that's not creating equity or energy democracy in any way. So I'm not sure if that's really an answer, but I think thinking through some of those questions of what are the things that we would want structurally and could employ maybe in regulation in our city, what are those questions? What are those things that we are non-negotiables?
So it's accountability to the larger community that needs to be brought in really in a structural way.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, let me add to that, and the reason why I want to add to that is because I'm actually in an MBA program up in New York, Barr College MBA in Sustainability, and we have a lot of people who are working on these very tight issues. And so I would say, in addition to the accountability, is also make the business case. And in that situation, you say, well, they said it would only exclusively be for the businesses if the lights went out and you wouldn't get anything. I would say go back to those businesses as a community, and as stakeholders and as users of their products and services, and say, we know that you have a microgrid lined up, and say, we shop here, we patronize your facility, we need you to help us put pressure back on the municipality and the people who are putting in that microgrid, and make the business case that they need to share that microgrid, in times where the power goes out. So I would say accountability, municipality, on the policy side, but also put pressure on the businesses that you are in your neighborhood and that you shop with and patronize with day in and day out.
Organized, yeah.
I think another way you can do is you can tell the utility that you use my rooftop to produce energy as well and provide me with energy. Our private properties we are so protective about, and then we ask some other person to share their private property is something you have to rethink about that. Okay, we are rich people, you don't have to cut the trees, you just put your solar panels on my rooftop. So if you are willing to do that, then they will also share their wealth with you.
So one thing that occurred to me is every one of the examples that you cited are indicating that these transitions have been made, and these alternative models seem to be working. Our communities that have nowhere near the resource demands that we see in the United States, whether it's for energy or food calories, and name your energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas for heating, or petroleum for the excessive driving we do. So I'm wondering whether you can show us a place where a transition has been made. Well, let's go back. Looking at our region, this area where we have these several massive corporations controlling our energy grid, where we have massive sprawl and excessive driving, what would that transition look like to where we could actually produce it even regionally, 100% renewable, controlled by the public? How would we back out of the situation we're in now? Most of our renewable capacity is either rooftop solar, or paving over farmland with solar, or offshore wind. That's what we have in the Mid-Atlantic right now. That's even doable if we're willing to make the investment.
And so the question is how we actually transition to a place in which we are utilizing those assets of renewable energy on top of our rooftops, and actually transition to 100% in a DC Mid-Atlantic context.
Well, take suburban Maryland and DC. How would we do that and transition from a corporate-owned situation, which is exactly what we have, to a publicly owned and managed situation that's democratized?
Yeah, I think that it's going to take multiple strategies. I think like there's groups like DC Sun, so Solar United Neighborhoods, that are doing really great work on creating cooperatives and buying solar for rooftops, and are working together on that, which is one component. I mean, I obviously will say publicize the damn utility, and let's take the for-profit motive out of this situation, and then we have the opportunity to kind of write the rules in a lot of ways so that we can ensure that we have democracy, we have equity, we can create situations where, you know, a third of our board is from workers, a third of our board is from the community, maybe a third is from, you know, representatives that are elected through, you know, that are our council members, and then creating that situation with, you know, engaged public participation, and that's how you could create something that could allow for energy democracy. I think, you know, it's a long struggle. What's happened in Boulder, Colorado is a really good example of, you know, watching a municipalization campaign go from 0 to 100. I mean, they're at about 80% right now. They had to come up with, because the reason they were doing this was to get to 100% by 2030. So that meant that they came up with a pretty involved climate, you know, plan, and how they were going to do that, and how they were going to integrate decentralized assets and larger assets within the Boulder area. So I think that they would be one example of where to look for, you know, on the ground strategies of how you do this.
I think, I mean, I was recently in
100% renewable energy target, so you can look at their website. Sierra Club, they're doing great work in 100% by 2030. So there's a lot of resources in their website.
Another example, I think, is I was recently in Totnes in the UK, so the whole transition town movement is actually trying to do exactly this with some degree of success. But I think one very crucial aspect here, which is often missing, though I know it's part of the energy democracy thing, is also to start questioning the demand itself. Question the demand, because unless one does that, solar will also be unsustainable. So will wind. And if we want to continue wanting the kind of amounts of energy that we want, then even renewables is really not renewable. I mean, at some point, somewhere, silica is being mined to create the solar, right? So, unless we do that, and I know the energy democracy and energy sovereignty movement is beginning to ask itself this question also: is all of this demand justified? It's not. We want to live lives that are of well-being and happy. Does that mean we need air conditioners in every room? In which case, you know, the bigger and bigger solar panels will be needed, and somebody somewhere is going to lose out because of the mining. So, I mean, I think we need to be able to start demanding questioning the consumption itself, the levels of consumption.
Given the time, I'm going to take just one more question, and if you don't mind, someone who hasn't asked a question before, so Colin.
Thank you, Basil. A bit of the flip side of that question, but I hope still relevant. A lot of what I've been hearing, just from Johanna, is like talking about changing systems that already exist, or remunicipalizing or municipalizing utilities that exist. And I'm curious, this is sort of for both of you, but the challenges and opportunities you see in energy democracy as a piece of energy access for the billions of people around the world who do not have access to reliable sources of energy and will need it in the coming decades. So both, you know, what role, I know these are distinct terms, so how does energy democracy relate to decentralized renewables, and how much of energy access needs to be focused on decentralized renewables? And then maybe for both of you, how does that play into some of the cooperative structures already existing in these places where we're kind of trying to get access to energy? If you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question, and maybe Ashish will have more enlightened answers than me, because I have worked very particularly within a U.S. and EU context, to be completely honest. You know, I think that there are studies showing that decentralized energy is the more effective pathway towards providing the supply that is necessary. And I think that there are ways to, and it seems as if there's already examples of where governance can come in and be really key here in, how you're providing that new supply and how it is governed, and integrating it with things that it sounds like in many of these communities that Ashish has mentioned are already there to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think there are examples. For instance, in central India, in state of Bihar, which is an extremely poor state, Greenpeace India has shown that a solar microgrid can actually electrify a whole village much faster than the centralized system could. The big problem there is that as soon as they did that, the state government was so embarrassed that they actually moved the central grid systems also into that village. So this created this awkward situation of a centralized grid system being cheaper than, of course, the local solar microgrid, because of all the fact that all the externalities, the costs are always externalized. So we have to simultaneously actually make the demand that the real costs of centralized systems, especially centralized fossil fuel systems, are built into that, in which case, in fact, that energy would be way more expensive than a local microgrid might be. And so then you're able to meet the energy democracy and energy access much more effectively than in a current system in which there is no level playing field. The playing field itself is so highly skewed that it would be very difficult to convince a community to go for something like that when they can get cheap power from the central grid, if they can get it.
So that brings us to the conclusion of an evening of really, really fascinating discussion about some of the deepest, thorniest, most difficult, and most essential to solve questions of our time. And once again, I want to say a huge thank you to both Ashish and Johanna. Ashish, who's come all the way from India, and Johanna, who's come all the way from half a block from there. So please join me in giving them a very good And very big thank you also to a lot of my colleagues. I can assure you that I didn't put this event together by myself. We have Derek here, and number of others who have helped through the course of the last few days to have this event happen successfully. And finally, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for spending your Wednesday evening here engaged in this very productive and very
Hi. I do. Yeah.